NumismaTalks. Every second and fourth Thursday of the month at noon Mountain, we will be here with a new presentation. During these presentations, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions, as all of you are muted on this presentation. Your question will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Now I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Jeff Pritchard. Jeff is a lifelong numismatist and retired financial planner. He has authored numerous articles and books on both personal finance and numismatics. Jeff has done prior presentations for NumismaTalks as well as for Newman Numismatic Symposiums. He is a member of the American Numismatic Society, American Numismatic Association, Liberty Seated Collectors Club, Pacific Coast Numismatic Society, and the Seattle Coin Club. Jeff will be presenting American Slavery and the Liberty Cap. Jeff, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen here. Well, thank you for the introduction, Paul, and thanks to all of you who are tuning into this. I think we're all pretty familiar with the Liberty Cap. It has been a symbol on our coinage since the 1790s. As you can see on the screen, it appears on some of our most popularly collected coins. And even today, it appears on our 1 ounce silver eagle, and it appears on commemoratives from time to time. The real origination of this presentation, I've been doing a lot of research on the Liberty Cap quite broadly. And during that research, 3 historical vignettes sort of surfaced that where it overlapped, the Liberty Cap overlapped or sort of intersected with American slavery. And those 3 vignettes were particularly thought-provoking, poignant, and tragically ironic in one case. So what I'm going to cover today is talk first about the actual origination of the symbol. How did it start? What did it represent? And then how it changed over time. Not only actually the physical cap itself changed, but also what it came to represent. And then the 3 vignettes. And the first is The Genius of America, which is actually a painting. But it was both influenced by and an influencer of early coinage. And the second is The Liberia Solution, in which American slavery actually spawned a new country, which then subsequently used the Liberty Cap on its coinage for almost 100 years. And finally, what I call numismatic's greatest irony. And this involves the Confederacy and the Civil War, and it's a series of kind of cascading disconnects, which would really be laughable if they weren't tied to, again, slavery and the Civil War. So let's begin. Well, since the beginning of time, virtually every society has employed slavery. This story, our story today, begins a little over 2,000 years ago in about 200 BC. In ancient Rome, if a slaveholder wanted to free one of their slaves, it required a formal ceremony called manumission. In Rome, this took place at the Temple of Feronia. And at the height of the ceremony, the slave was touched with a rod or a staff called a vindicta. And at this point, the slave was free. Since that time, in order to kind of recognize their newfound freedom, the slave's head was shaved, and on their head was placed a small white, kind of a hard woolen cap called a pallias. And only free persons were allowed to wear the cap. And since that time, those 2 items, those 2 symbols, the rod or the staff and the pallias, the Liberty Cap, became symbols of freedom and liberty. And when the goddess Liberty was portrayed, or Libertas, as she was called in ancient Roman times, she was frequently portrayed holding that staff of manumission and the Liberty Cap. Well, it wasn't long until those 2 symbols were usurped or expanded to not only represent freedom from slavery, but also freedom from political tyranny and even freedom from religious oppression. This is the earliest numismatic representation of that, and this is a denarius of Caius Cassius from 126 BC. And you can see on the reverse, you've got Libertas driving the chariot, holding the staff in one hand, and the pallias, the Liberty Cap, in the other. Now, this coin was commissioned to kind of commemorate the initiation of um, secret ballots. On the obverse of the coin, down that smaller version down there at 7 o'clock, you can see a small round object. That represents a voting urn. And again, this was the initiation of secret ballots for jurists so they wouldn't face political retribution. So again, the Peleus here representing freedom from political tyranny. Well, certainly the probably the most famous and certainly the most highly prized example of the Peleus or the Liberty Cap appearing on early Roman coinage is the Brutus denarius. Now, this was commissioned between 43 and 42 BC by Cassius and Brutus, who were the two main instigators in the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC on the Ides of March. And on the obverse, you can see a portrait of Brutus. And on the reverse, you have two drawn daggers representing the assassination itself above Ide Mar, which is the Ides of March. And again, Brutus and Cassius commissioned this coin to, in some ways, really justify the assassination. But you can see in the center of the reverse, Peleus, the Liberty Cap, again, representing freedom from Caesar's tyrannical rule. And now, interestingly, Caesar's assassination was not very popular with the Roman citizens. There were a lot of riots afterwards, and Cassius and Brutus actually had to flee the city for their own personal safety several days after the assassination. Now, there's about 80 to 100 of these coins known to exist. And again, they're highly prized. When they change hands, it's typically for low to mid six-figure amounts. Now, it's a quick side note, but there's actually a golden version of that coin, and that's the golden Arius. And there's only 3 known examples of this known to exist. And whereas that silver Brutus denarius was intended for general circulation, the golden Arius was intended as a kind of a presentation piece for high-ranking officials. And this specific coin here, it was got a lot of headlines about a year ago. It was exported out of Greece, where it had been held by a coin dealer, and it was sold at public auction for a little over $4 million. And then in 2023, they discovered that it had been essentially looted out of the country under a false pedigree. And our Department of Homeland Security returned the coin to Greece, where it had been held. The British coin dealer who masterminded this fraud, my understanding, he's currently enjoying the hospitality of the British penal system. But anyway, as I mentioned, Libertas appeared on that early Roman coinage from time to time. This is a Elagabalus denarius from 2020 AD. And again, you can see Libertas holding the staff, the Liberty Cap. This is another example of Libertas on a Roman coin. The last known appearance of Libertas with the Liberty Cap on Roman coinage appeared in 284 AD. And after that, there was nothing. There was literally a 1,200-year gap to where the Liberty Cap appeared on any numismatic item around the globe. And it next appeared in 1552 on a French medal commissioned by Henry II of France to commemorate his victory over Charles V of Germany. Now, after 1,200 years, I think we can accord the engraver a little artistic license. But you can see the reverse conceptually very similar to that Brutus denarius. You've got 2 raised swords representing the battle. And in the center, you've got the engraver's interpretation of what a Liberty Cap should look like. And again, this was commissioned by Henry II to promote himself as a benevolent liberator and a protector of Christianity. When we move forward 200 years to a coin that had enormous influence on our own early US coinage, and that, of course, is the Libertas Americana medal. This was commissioned by Benjamin Franklin and executed by the renowned French medalist engraver Augustin Dupre. This was in 1783. And you can see on the obverse, we've got the flowing hairstyle Liberty, which was kind of an innovative portrayal of liberty at the time. And over her shoulder is the staff and the Liberty cap. Now you'll note this is still that hard kind of felt Palais style Liberty cap. And it's during this period, the 1780s and the 1790s, when that Liberty cap, it changed, how it was portrayed changed to what's called the softer Phrygian style Liberty cap. This is from a Roman frieze from about 125 AD. And it pictures the Phrygian style cap. And you can see it's softer. It's typically pictured tilting forward or off to one side. And this really became an international icon for freedom and liberty during the French Revolution, when Parisians primarily donned this Phrygian style Liberty cap to display their displeasure with the monarchy. Interestingly, the US revolutionaries also wore this cap. It was worn by groups like the Sons of Liberty, which included the likes of Paul Revere, and actually our own revolutionary fighters who were in the army, but who didn't have that formal Continental Army uniform, but also wear this Phrygian style Liberty cap. And they often had Liberty embroidered or stitched across the front. But it really didn't become that internationally recognized icon for freedom and liberty until the French Revolution. So apparently they had a better public relations firm than the US did at the time. But this leads us to the first historical vignette. And this occurred in 1792 in Philadelphia. Several years before that, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and this was a library formed by Benjamin Franklin in 1731, they decided they were going to move to new facilities. And a kind of a self-promoting artist by the name of Samuel Jennings, his family was from Philadelphia and he was born and bred in Philadelphia, but he got wind of this. And so he contacted the library and proposed that he would do a large painting for them to display to the public. And after some back and forth, the library agreed. But the library committee had three themes that they wanted Jennings to include in this large painting he was going to do. And in order of priority, those themes were: one, they wanted to promote their lending inventory. This library company was actually a for-profit entity, and so they wanted to lend more books. The second theme was patriotism. This was a new country, and certainly that was appropriate. But the third theme was abolitionism. This library committee was comprised primarily of Quakers who had a very strong anti-slavery belief. In fact, the original abolitionist movement in this country started in Pennsylvania because of the high percentage of Quakers in the area. But the resulting work by Jennings is considered the first allegorical anti-slavery painting done by an American artist. And this is the resulting work. Now, this is on a 5-foot by 6-foot canvas. And Jennings painted it in 1791, and it was delivered to the library in 1792. It actually has two titles, or names. One is Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences. And the second is The Genius of America, Encouraging the Emancipation of the Blacks. Now, the reason this was unusually influential for a painting is because where it was based. First, it was based in the library. And so all of Philadelphia's, I guess what you call intelligentsia, would visit the library and see this painting. Secondly, you better remember at this time, Philadelphia was our nation's capital from 1790 to 1800. And so all your political, thought leaders, political influencers were in the Philadelphia area. And then lastly, a month after this painting was delivered to the library, the Coinage Act of 1792 was passed, which of course established our first mint in Philadelphia. Well, the library committee wanted Jennings to include three very specific symbols in this painting. First and most obviously, of course, is the goddess Liberty with the staff with the Liberty cap atop it, which Jennings dutifully complied with. She is obviously the highlight or the central focal point of the painting. And you'll notice that he has painted her with that softer Phrygian style Liberty cap. Jennings was actually criticized for his portrayal of Liberty in this painting. He was kind of considered a mediocre talent. This is actually his seminal work. But he was criticized because he portrayed Liberty in clothing of his era, as opposed to Greco-Roman robes or something. The second symbol that the committee wanted him to include in this painting were pictures of African Americans in a pose of, quote, ease and joy. And you can see in the background, there are African Americans celebrating around a Liberty pole. And in sort of the midground over to the right, we have four African Americans paying homage to Liberty in what one historian called a pose of period supplication, because they will soon to be freed or had been freed by Liberty. The third symbol was broken chains at Liberty's feet, which Jennings included. Now, like any good allegorical painting, Jennings included a lot of sort of hidden symbols, anti-slavery symbols. And these appear sort of in the clutter of objects down at the bottom of the painting. I think in today's vernacular, we call these Easter eggs. But the first symbol, now these are the broken chains at Liberty's feet. And granted, the committee actually did specifically request these. But in Jennings' own word, this is to represent Liberty's, an emblem in display Liberty's aversion to slavery. And a kind of an interesting side note, this same symbolism of broken chains at the feet of Liberty, less known to many people, but was carried forward, and they appear at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, or broken chains. Well, at the bottom of that painting, there's also a piece of sheet music. And this isn't just kind of random sheet music. It's Handel's Come Ever Smiling Liberty from Judas Maccabeus. Now, I'm far from a music expert, and so I had to look this up. Judas Maccabeus is what's called it's a 3-act oratorio. And these are musical compositions that typically deal with sacred topics, and they combine chorus, solo voices, and orchestra. Well, there's also a bust at the bottom of this painting of a man in Roman robes. And historians believe this is supposed to be Henry Thornton. Henry Thornton was a prominent English abolitionist, very outspoken member of parliament. And his real claim to fame was that in 1791, when this painting was being done, he established the Sierra Leone Company. And the purpose of the Sierra Leone Company, albeit somewhat misguided, was to provide a safe haven for freed slaves. Now, I say historians believe this because Jennings didn't write down some of these symbols that he had that he put in the painting. Well, certainly the most cryptic Easter egg, if you will, is the painting of the globe, because Jennings specifically painted it to highlight the Caribbean. And again, historians believe that Jennings was trying to highlight the colony of Saint Domingue, which today we know as Haiti. Because in 1791, when this was being painted, that's when the slave revolts began in Haiti. And they actually continued up until 1804, at which time the slave population and, of course, Haiti itself won their independence. But again, the painting was extremely influential because of where it was based. Well, a few years later, we have our very early half cents and cents. And you can see that this is almost a carbon copy of that Libertas Americana medal done 10 years earlier by Augustin Dupre. And we see on both of these, the half cent to the left and the large cent on the right, that flowing hair style liberty. Again, a very innovative portrayal of a hairstyle at the time. And over her shoulder is the staff with the liberty cap. And you'll note that it is that softer, flexible Phrygian style liberty cap. And by this point in time, the Peleus style liberty cap has essentially disappeared from art, numismatics, kind of the public sphere. And it really has transitioned to that Phrygian style liberty cap. Well, this brings us to the second vignette. And this began in 1816 when a Presbyterian minister by the name of Robert Finley, along with a lot of Virginia slaveholders, formed the American Colonization Society. And the purpose of this society was to recolonize freeborn African Americans or freed slaves. And functionally, how they did this was the society bought land in sort of that almost westernmost area of Africa on the coast, in an area called Cape Mesurado. And they christened that land Liberia, meaning land of freedom. Now, one of the interesting things about this colonization society is it attracted members and supporters from absolute opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, this is the epitome of strange bedfellows. At one end of the spectrum, you've got slaveholders. Slaveholders wanted freed slaves removed from the country. They were primarily terrified of a broad-based slave revolt like what you saw in Haiti years earlier. And there were slave uprisings from time to time. There were instances where slaveholders, their families were killed. The slaveholders were worried about something really broad-based. So they wanted freed slaves removed from the country so they couldn't incite their enslaved brethren. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you had Quakers, Presbyterian congregations, really ardent abolitionists. But they were worried that freed slaves would face discrimination, disenfranchisement, a denial of their social or their civil rights. And they really believed this was in the best interest of freed slaves. Now, as you can imagine, this was controversial right from the start, particularly with freed slaves. For many of them, America had become their home. And for those who'd been here for any length of time, their memories of Africa were very distant. And very few of them had any ties to that tiny spot of land on the western coast of Africa, of Liberia. Well, despite the controversy, in 1822, the society began recolonizing freed slaves. Now, this was entirely voluntary. The freed slaves would be given a plot of land. They were given 6 months of provisions. But just like the early settling of the United States back in the, early 1600s, the going was very tough. It was very hard. Between 1822 and 1843, the society recolonized a little under 4,600 freed slaves to Liberia. But by 1843, less than half of those had survived. And that was primarily a result of disease. There were other issues, though. For example, the recolonized African Americans, freed slaves, didn't get along with the local tribespeople. And there were a lot of violent, bloody clashes between those two groups. One of the kind of a sad commentary around this whole incident is a lot of the freed slaves had farms in Liberia. And obviously, getting some cheap labor would certainly be helpful. And so a lot of the freed American slaves captured local tribespeople and made them slaves. So kind of a sad commentary on mankind. Well, this whole recolonization concept was very popular with some of our most early and ardent abolitionists, the likes of Henry Clay, John Adams, even Abraham Lincoln. And it was popular with Thomas Jefferson. Now, I'm digressing here a bit. I mean, you could do a whole webinar on Jefferson's views on slavery. Today we've come to realize they were complex, they were contradictive, they were hypocritical. There's three, I guess, incidents that really stand out in my mind on that. First, we all know that he wrote that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, in the first draft of the Declaration, Jefferson specifically called out the inhumanity of the slave trade, which Great Britain dominated at that time. But he himself was a slaveholder. In 1784, Jefferson proposed legislation to the Virginia State House that actually would have eliminated slavery in the state of Virginia by the year 1800. Yet he never really expended any political capital or really made any great effort for passage of that legislation. And finally, several years before his death, Jefferson wrote on the necessity, the righteousness of emancipation. Yet even on his deathbed, he never freed his own bondsmen. But Jefferson, in 1781, Jefferson wrote something that's particularly poignant today. And this was in what's called the Notes on the State of Virginia. And in reality, this was essentially his personal diary with his musings about a lot of issues, a variety of issues that faced Virginia. One of them being slavery, and of course, this whole issue of recolonization. And this wasn't published until 1785. It was actually published against Jefferson's wishes, because he was actually worried that his views on many items, including slavery, would be viewed as too moderate and might hurt him politically. But in 1781, Jefferson wrote that it would be exceedingly difficult to retain and incorporate the blacks into the state because white prejudice and black memories of past wrongs would lead to disorders. And I highlight those 8 words because it's kind of a sad commentary that on our society. I mean, here we are 250 years later, 10, 12 generations later, and we still, as a society, struggle to resolve these two opposing dynamics. Well, anyway, I digress. When I get back to numismatics, that's why what you're all interested in. So in 1847, after 25 years of financially supporting Liberia, this colonization society decided it was time to kind of pull the plug financially. And so they contacted Governor Roberts, who incidentally was the first Black governor of Liberia. And they told him, financially, Liberia, you're on your own. And shortly thereafter, Governor Roberts declared Liberia an independent republic. And this was on July 26, 1847. In fact, you can see the similarities between the Liberian flag and the US flag. And incidentally, Roberts was elected the first president of Liberia. Well, Liberia needed coinage. And so in 1847, they contracted with the private Soho Mint of Birmingham, England, to create this coinage. And this is the obverse and reverse of most of their denominations at the time. And this is an 1847 cent. But you can see on the obverse, we've got Liberty wearing that Phrygian style Liberty cap. The star on the cap is representative that Liberia was the first independent republic on the entire continent of Africa. And they actually used this obverse design for almost 100 years, up until the mid-1930s, at which time they replaced it with, figures from Liberia's own history. The reverse, you can see a palm tree. This is a very common motif used on coinage throughout all of West Africa at this period of time. And then if you look closely, you can see out on the horizon on the reverse, a tiny a side paddle wheeler under steam. Well, in 1865, Liberia proposed it. They had developed a number of patterns because they were considering updating their coinage. And certainly the most fascinating pattern that Liberia came up with is this pictured here. Because you can see it's virtually a carbon copy of our own seated liberty coinage, which was kind of our coin of the realm, our silver coin of the realm during this period of time. And on the reverse, you can see an eagle. And on that shield on its chest, instead of the stripes on the like on the US reverse, you've got the palm tree. And if you look really closely, they've even tried to squeeze in that side paddle wheel around that tiny space. But the obverse of the coin, clearly we have the goddess Liberty holding that staff of manumission with the Liberty cap atop of it. And the star that is shining above the goddess Liberty, the star on the cap, again, is representative of Liberia being the first independent republic on the entire continent of Africa. Well, our third vignette, and what I call numismatic's greatest irony, and I really think it is, this involves kind of a series of cascading disconnects, which really, they'd be outright laughable if they weren't tied to the atrocity of slavery and to the tragedy of the Civil War. And to kind of set the stage, I want to run through this quick chronology with you. So December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes from the Union. And as they say, the game is afoot. On January 26th of 1861, the Republic of Louisiana, they called themselves that for about 6 weeks. The Republic of Louisiana seizes the United States Mint in New Orleans, the building, all the equipment, and about 900,000 in bullion. On March 21st of that year, Louisiana officially joins the Confederacy. And on April 1st, Louisiana turns the mint, all the facilities, the equipment, and the remaining bullion over to the Confederacy. And then almost a month later to the day, the Secretary of the Confederate Treasury, C.J. Meminger, closes the mint and it ceases operations for the duration of the war. And I'm going to start this discussion on irony. This is a little counterintuitive by talking about a coin that I'm purposely excluding from this conversation. And that's the so-called Confederate cent. Now I'm excluding it despite the fact this coin has a colorful, a very intriguing history. Despite the fact that serious collectors will pay six-figure amounts to own one of the 16 known specimens. And despite the fact we clearly have the Phrygian-style Liberty cap on the obverse. It's actually, in this instance, worn by Minerva, the god of war and justice. But I'm excluding it. By all accounts, this is essentially a fantasy piece made by a Wilkins engraver by the name of Robert Lovett, who lived in Philadelphia. And the thinking is that Lovett made this in the hopes that the Confederacy would approve it to both his financial and personal benefit. In fact, he used this obverse design, not the lettering, but the Minerva with the Liberty hat, on 3 prior commercial tokens that he did. In fact, there's in the September 2023 issue of the Numismatist, there's an article about Robert Lovett and one of his commercial tokens tied to the Civil War. But the reason we're excluding it, there's no proof that anyone from the Confederacy ever commissioned the coin, no proof that anyone ever from the Confederacy ever saw the coin, and certainly never approved it. And there's some numismatic historians that believe it actually wasn't struck until 1874. But one of the key elements, of course, is that if, based on what I'm going to get to in a minute, if Confederate leadership ever had to approve this coin, speaking specifically Jefferson Davis, this coin would never have seen the light of day. But let's look at the coins that specifically were connected to the Confederacy and where this irony begins. So between January 26th of 1861 and the end of March, while the mint was under the control of Louisiana, they minted a little over 1.2 million half dollars. When the Confederacy controlled the mint in April, they minted another 960,000 half dollars. Now, in reality, this was just, they were just using the United States dies. These were United States half dollars. And on the obverse, we have our goddess Liberty holding the staff of manumission and with the Liberty cap. And the irony, of course, is here you've got the South that has seceded from the Union. They'll soon be fighting, killing, dying in an attempt to preserve slavery. And yet the Confederacy is frantically minting coins bearing those two original symbols that celebrate the freeing of slaves. Well, originally the Confederacy hoped to have their own coinage. And in light of that, in early April of 1861, the Secretary of the Confederate Treasury, C.J. Memminger, called for design proposals. And this is where the irony escalates, because the design that Memminger selected, first, the obverse is the very same obverse on the United States half dollars, with the goddess Liberty and those two symbols of manumission. Now, in reality, this was a practical decision. We have to remember at this time, all the dies were made in Philadelphia, and they were then shipped to the branch mints, whether that was Dahlonega, whether that was Charlotte, whether that was, in this case, New Orleans. So there were no experienced die sinkers or coin engravers in the South. So this would allow the mint to continue using those obverse dies. But the reverse is really where the irony escalates, because this was specifically designed for the Confederacy. And this is the reverse of the Confederate half dollar. And we can see in the center, there's a shield, 7 stars atop 7 stripes. And this represents the 7 states that at this time had seceded from the Union. Eventually, there'd be 11. To our left of the shield are cotton blossoms. To the right, and I've seen this described as wheat, and I've seen it described as sugar. But on top of the shield, plain as day, we've got the staff with a Liberty cap atop of it. Now, the Confederacy made 4 of these patterns. And prior to producing any large quantity, Secretary Memminger closed the New Orleans Mint. That was on April 30th. And there's several schools thought of why the mint was closed. The most recent thinking is that the northern blockade of the southern ports had been so effective that it virtually eliminated the South's international trade. And say they had no real need for hard coinage or specie. There were 4 of these produced. One of them went to Secretary Memminger, who in turn presented it to President Jefferson Davis. Now, we have no way of knowing if Memminger understood the origination of these 2 symbols. Memminger himself was a slaveholder. In fact, prior to the Civil War, he was an attorney. Many of his clients were slaveholders, and he prosecuted runaway slaves and whatnot. But we do know that Jefferson Davis was intimately familiar with the origination of these 2 symbols. And in light of that, he couldn't have been too happy with the coin's design. It's often overlooked, but prior to the Civil War, Jefferson Davis was the United States Secretary of the War. This was between 1853 and 1857 under Franklin Pierce's administration. And in addition to those responsibilities, Jefferson Davis had been tasked with the capital extension construction. That included overseeing the creation of a 20-foot tall bronze statue that was to be placed at the very top of the Capitol dome, a statue of freedom. And in light of that, in 1854, a sculptor by the name of Thomas Crawford was commissioned to do this 20-foot tall bronze statue of freedom. Crawford was also commissioned to create 2 statues inside the Capitol, one of history one of justice. This was in a portico above a doorway that Crawford was designing. Well, Crawford's original design for the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol Dome and also of the Statue of History envisioned freedom wearing a Phrygian style liberty cap. Well, Jefferson Davis saw this and kind of went ballistic. And his feedback, which was probably cleaned up in the transition, was relayed by an intermediary by the name of Montgomery Mix, who said that Davis does not like the liberty cap introduced into the composition, that American liberty is original and not of the freed slave. So based on this, we can see Jefferson Davis understood where these symbols originated. Well, Crawford getting this commission and being able to do these statues was entirely dependent upon the goodwill of Jefferson Davis. And it was an important commission. And so Crawford relented to Jefferson Davis' request, and he changed the liberty cap, which was to be atop of freedom on the Capitol Dome, to a war bonnet. And this picture is what you see still standing today atop the dome, is the liberty cap being replaced with that war bonnet. The Statue of History inside the Capitol, which was going to also wear a liberty cap, that was replaced with a laurel wreath. So again, the very symbols that were on that Confederate $50, Jefferson Davis had made sure were nowhere near the Capitol, about 10 years earlier. Well, a month after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Jefferson Davis was finally captured by Union troops. And one of the very few items in his possession when he was captured was that $50, that Confederate pattern $50 that Memminger had given him. And this is a picture of that specific $50. Now, if you're looking closely at this picture, this coin does not have a nick on the rim at 3 o'clock. That's my poor use of the software. But this is the actual $50. And sometime during Davis's captivity, this was stolen or seized, and it kind of disappeared from public view for quite a while. It was held by a Bream family by the name of Bream, for several generations in Pennsylvania. They then sold it to a dealer, and it really was quietly held, and it didn't really become known broad-based in the public until a 1961 New York City coin show, when a dealer kind of unexpectedly brought it and was obtained its real notoriety. That the coin changed hands several times since then, and then in 2015, it traded at public auction, and it sold for a little over $880,000. Again, these are highly prized. In fact, the Newman specimen, which was sold at public auction 2 years later in 2017, and it was in a better grade, sold for $960,000. Excuse me. Well, this final vignette, I kind of feel there's a real poignant metaphor here. And that is, at the very time that Jefferson Davis was captured, when the South was finally defeated, not only did Jefferson Davis carry those two symbols of manumission on the Confederate $50, but because that was sort of our coin of the realm, the seated dollar coinage at this time, virtually every U.S. citizen in their purse, in their pocket, also were carrying those two symbols of manumission. That's kind of poetic, poetic justice, poetic testimony that of a nation once and for all ridding itself from the scourge of slavery. On a final note, I look at all these, these three vignettes overall, and I kind of like to think that our continued use of the Liberty Cap, be it on our 1 ounce silver eagle, be it on commemoratives like this from time to time, kind of acts as a marker or maybe a milestone in both, as a country, how far we've come, but the work we still have ahead in finally in getting closer and closer to achieving our founding ideals. And with that, I will entertain any questions. Thank
Great,
you.
Jeff. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. It looks like you've done a ton of research, so that's amazing. Actually, one of the questions says, excellent presentation. Are you planning to continue your research on this topic? If so, what directions are you planning to take?
There's an extensive article that'll be coming out in the Gobrek Journal. Now that's a fairly narrow audience. I appreciate. I may expand it. I'm debating whether to expand it into, maybe a short book of some sort. Because as I think a lot of the people watching know, the Liberty Cap appears on foreign coinage all over the world. It's really been broadly adopted by even a lot of countries today, and it has a lot of unusual formats. The Dutch version of the Liberty Cap in the 1600s, it looks more like Indiana Jones fedora. It's the funniest looking thing. So there's a lot of areas to continue or explore.
Okay. Another question on the 1861 Confederate cent, you identify the central figure as Minerva. How can you tell the difference between Liberty and Minerva?
Well, I can tell the difference only because of the research, and others identify the difference. So that's a fair question. I don't know how the researchers would tell one from the other than maybe the engraver or the designer made that difference.
Great. Well, I don't have any more questions popping up yet. I'll give it another minute. I'll kind of do my wrap up and check back here and make sure I don't miss anything. But I do want to thank you and thank everybody that was here for being here at our presentation. Our NumismaTalks are being recorded, and they will be available. This is new. They are going to be available on our e-learning academy. So those are going to be held until we kick that off in April. So that's pretty exciting for us here at the ANA. So I hope that everybody's waiting anxiously to get those going. Please be sure to check for future programs on our website at money.org. You can go to the events and learning tab and then check in on NumismaTalks. Let's see, we've got a couple more. Let's see. The information fills several gaps in my understanding of American history. So where does the painting hang?
So there's three versions of the painting. The largest one is in the Library Company of Philadelphia, which still exists. I believe I had somebody else tell me that it no longer is on public display, unfortunately, but that's where the largest one exists. The picture of myself at the very end, there's two what are called studies for the painting. And these are like 1 foot by 1 foot. One hangs in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The other one hangs in a small museum in Delaware, and the name is escaping me at the time. But my understanding is the large one, the Library Company of Philadelphia, no longer has it on public display for whatever reason.
Okay. How could you attribute the sheet music in the painting to Handel?
You can actually read it. And again, this is more research, but you can actually look at it and other research, I'm standing on the shoulders of folks a lot smarter than myself. But other researchers identified the music. My musical understanding is so limited that I would in no way be able to recognize it from just the notes.
Right. Well, I think you've got a lot of great talk, and thanks for presenting. So I think everybody enjoyed their time here. I appreciate you doing this for a second time. So that's amazing. And hopefully I can get you on for something else soon.